Tom Fitton. He's the president of Judicial Watch and the author of A Republic Under Assault. And he joins us now. Tom, great to have you back with us.
Hey, Vince, good to be with you.
What do we make of this story? What do you make of this story?
Well, the FBI and the DOJ, in my view, are irredeemably compromised by corrupt and political decision-making. I mean, this wasn't just a run-of-the-mill crime that the FBI, wrongly instigated through this conspiracy. It was a prosecution that was used in October of 2020 to target Trump. You had Biden trying to go after Trump and the media generally targeting Trump. And so this was a political cudgel that was used against Trump. And of course, who was the target here? People who were likely to support Trump, people who oppose COVID, the wrong type as far as the deep state goes. And, there was no rule they were unwilling to break. And this is why, the whole argument about, the targeting of Trump, should be concerning to all Americans because, the FBI not only did this type of activity in terms of manufacturing crimes to spy on Trump, but they were going after ordinary Americans as well, as confirmed by the jury in this case.
Exactly. I said there were very few exceptions here when it came to the media's coverage. One of those exceptions, notably, was BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed covered this story well and had early indications that this was a setup by the FBI, and it didn't involve private citizens leading the charge to kidnap any American governor. And in fact, in BuzzFeed's coverage today, I want to quote from some of it. They say defense attorneys in both the state and federal cases have contended in a series of court filings and pretrial hearings that their clients may have been loudmouths or even anti-government cranks, but they never actually intended to hurt anyone and couldn't have pulled off a kidnapping to save their own lives. Fox, the lawyers noted, one of the defendants, was so hapless he lived in the basement of a vacuum cleaner store and was forced to go to the Mexican restaurant next door when he needed to use the bathroom. Croft, for his part, ranted about shooting down airships, cutting down every tree on the border between Ohio and Michigan, and setting off electromagnetic pulse weapons that his lawyer, Joshua Blanchard, characterized at trial as, quote, movie stuff. And they go on to explain that, again, we had dozens of FBI agents and informants all around these ne'er-do-wells in order to frame these guys. And so your point, Tom, is it's not just going after two poor guys who can barely defend themselves. It's about going after Donald Trump and people who supported him broadly, in your view.
Yeah, that's right. And, I'm not Joe Biden's the one who mentioned this in the campaign. It was Whitmer who was highlighting this being typical of the Trump way of thinking. And, and as BuzzFeed notes, the defense in the trial could only put in a small portion of the evidence showing that this was an entrapment scheme by the FBI. As you point out, I think there were 12 informants. 6 have been targeted? I mean, you had double the number of people working for the FBI in the so-called plot than you had actual alleged plotters. It's incredible.
There's a lot of incompetence here. Go ahead. I'll let you finish that thought. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, and BuzzFeed's involvement here highlights the concern that the left used to have that the FBI can't be trusted. And maybe there's something we can all come together on between the left and the right, that federal law enforcement's just way too politicized to trust with pretty much anything they've been doing these days. I don't trust them to prosecute jaywalking at this point.
These the guys who were accused here, I'm going to read more about an event that took place on September 12th of 2020. The FBI had encouraged these guys to go after Whitmer, and the government's telling BuzzFeed writes, the most critical moment in the alleged plot took place late on September 12th, 2020, when Fox, Croft, and others piled into 3 trucks and headed out to conduct nighttime surveillance of Gretchen Whitmer's lakeside cottage. It was not a great success. For one thing, their companions that night included 2 confidential informants and 2 undercover agents. Some 10 additional FBI agents followed them en route, and stationary cameras mounted at strategic spots tracked their progress. For another, despite all of the careful planning, the men failed to find Gretchen Whitmer's house because they had been given the wrong address, and heavy rains made it impossible for them to spot one another from across the lake as they had hoped to do. In other words, Tom, this is complete incompetence. The guys that they were choosing, that the FBI picked to push this kind of kidnapping plot, they couldn't even find a house on a map.
And, if they had found this material early on that these folks were talking smack in a way that might have been potentially dangerous, there are all sorts of things they could have done short of manufacturing and, frankly, creating a dangerous situation where they were encouraging these folks to engage in criminal activity that they otherwise wouldn't have engaged in. It's only for the grace of God that something serious didn't happen as a result of this FBI plot, and there needs to be accountability. I mean, some of the top FBI people involved in this, what you would think were demoted. No, they weren't demoted. They were moved over to D.C. So, some of the same gang is responsible for making sure that all those terrible January 6th protesters are being prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and I use that sarcastically, given the outrageous overreach in a lot of those cases. This is something that we should understand. It's a culture that is through and through the FBI,
yeah.
from the guys in the individual offices in the various states to headquarters. It's part of the same approach. They don't care what the rules are because they don't feel like they'll ever be held accountable. And indeed, it's a safe bet if you're the FBI.
All right, Tom Fitton, you've connected January 6th and the FBI's activities. I want to play a piece of audio for you. This comes to us from James O'Keefe and Project Veritas. They had an undercover video that captured New York Times reporter Matthew Rosenberg not long ago talking about the FBI's presence on January 6th. Listen to this.
We're the ones, not Fox, not Breitbart, who actually went and uncovered the fact that, there were a ton of FBI informants on the people who attacked the Capitol. That was us, not the right-wing guys. You need the sources from within to dig into those places. You need the sources from within to dig into those places. But it's especially over the CIA.
Okay, he said in that, if it was hard to hear, there were a ton of FBI informants among the people who went into the Capitol. So what kind of lessons can we draw from the Gretchen Whitmer case and the way we think about the events of January 6th, Tom Fitton?
You should presume the worst. You should presume that the FBI and the federal government were in a position to stop criminal activity on January 6th. Indeed, as the New York Times confirmed, there was at least one FBI informant. There was other reporting showing that, or admissions in court filings, showing that even the D.C. government, the D.C. police had an informant at the Capitol grounds that day. So the question is, what did they know and when about the criminal activity they were witnessing? Did they participate or encourage it in any way? And, of course, the most famous question, or the most important question a lot of other people have, is what about this Ray Epps character, who was obviously inciting activity on the grounds of the Capitol, yet has yet to be targeted by the FBI?
Right. Ray Epps telling people to go into the building the night before, saying tomorrow we're going into the building. And he was accused by the crowd of being a Fed. They started chanting, Fed, 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 pointing in his direction. And ever since then, not clear answers at all about what his role was and why he wasn't charged. Having clearly, if anyone incited people to go into the building, it's that guy, Tom.
Yep. And, look, January 6th, there are a lot of mysteries about what went on January 6th. And I think anyone who engaged in outrageous violence, like some of what we saw, obviously they should be prosecuted. There's no real question about that. But the other question I have is that almost always riots occur because of poor decision-making by the political officials and police officials who are developing the law enforcement response. Who is responsible for that? What did they do? Why didn't they do things at a certain time? And that's not something the January 6th committee is interested in, but you can bet Judicial Watch through litigation is trying to figure it out. I mean, everyone knew there was going to be tens of thousands of people at the Capitol that day, and there wasn't sufficient security. Why not?
Great question. Last piece on this. On Friday, Alejandro Mayorkas, the DHS secretary, was speaking at an event, if you can believe it, and I know you can, run by Al Sharpton. It was Al Sharpton's National Action Network conference in New York City. And while there, Mayorkas claimed, according to Fox News, that white supremacists pose the biggest terror threat to the United States. He assessed that, quote, the greatest terrorism-related threat that we face in the homeland is the threat of domestic violent extremism. He cited an increase in hate spread on social media and other online platforms, and he further specified, quote, the most prominent threat is the threat of white supremacists. Have you seen data to support claims like this, Tom Fitton?
No, I mean, that sounds like a Garland's memo that we have to worry about parents being terrorists. Look, there's extremism on both sides of the political aisle where people can be motivated to engage in violent behavior. The evidence is, in terms of organized violence, it's the left. For instance, January 6th was not a product of right-wing organized violence. It happened because there was an opportunity that resulted in violence taking place because of the poor security at the time. In fact, if they had proper security, there would have been no violence on January 6th, in my view. So the idea that January 6th is which is the code for what Mayorkas is saying here, is an indication of a broader problem. It's baloney. That was a collapse of security that led to violence, and that's a simple, sad statement about the state of our federal law enforcement. Even after all these years, they don't know how to tie their shoes.
Yeah, and then notice he didn't bring up the case of Matthew Martin. Matthew Martin, a week ago, was acquitted. He's a New Mexico man. He was acquitted of misdemeanor charges for illegally entering the Capitol on January 6th. His defense, the cops let him in. The cops gestured him in. The judge was satisfied by that, and that he secured an acquittal here. And that, of course, not coming up in Mayorkas' assessment here, Tom.
Two big embarrassments for the DOJ with that. And first one of any of the January 6th defendants acquitted, and you have to wonder if others are going to be acquitted or appeal based on that analysis. And then, of course, the Whitmer thing. It would be difficult to overstate the scandalous corruption that we have that has been confirmed with this jury verdict. And the question is there going to be accountability? And I don't think, we're geared towards accountability for the FBI. There's this whistling past the graveyard on it,
Yes.
Vince. And there's, to me, it's got to be dug up by its roots to figure out where the corruption is and change its mission and personnel and direction in dramatic ways to protect our liberties from abuse by a political operation that's posing as law enforcement.
Yep. One John Durham digging into one Hunter Biden story or whatever, or digging into the Trump stuff is not enough. It's just, kind of nibbling at the edges. We need a lot more. Tom Fitton, thank you as always. Really good to talk to you. Always really good to talk to you. Always really